Mr.ShroomCaster. I've always been the kind of guy who prides himself on getting stuff done. Deadlines, pressure, last-minute changes. I'm usually the one who steps up when everyone else is freaking out. It's not like I love chaos, but when things get crazy, I feel this pull to take control. So, yeah, people count on me. And honestly, I've always liked being that guy. But this time was different. It all started on what was supposed to be just another busy day at Bright Code Solutions, the software company I'd been with for the past 3 years. We were working on a major contract for a startup that was planning to disrupt the health tech industry. Our team was building a scheduling platform for medical professionals, something that could integrate with hospital systems and let doctors and nurses pick up extra shifts seamlessly. It was sleek, intuitive, and packed with AI features to predict staffing shortages before they happened. It was also a nightmare. The back end was a spaghetti mess of API calls, the front-end animations kept glitching, and the client kept changing their minds about what they wanted. We were 2 days away from the deadline, and while things weren't perfect, we were on track. At least that's what I thought. Then it happened. David, our lead dev and the guy responsible for integrating the payment processing feature, vanished. No emails, no texts, just a vague Slack message about a family emergency. At first, we were sympathetic. Stuff happens, right? But when the hours ticked by and he wasn't responding to any of us, panic started to set in. I wasn't even supposed to touch his part of the code. It was too specialized. But with no one else to pick up the slack, it all landed on me. "Can I count on you?" my manager, Lisa, asked during one of those closed-door meetings where you can tell she's trying not to look as desperate as she feels. What was I supposed to say? No? That's not who I am. So I nodded. Yeah, I'll figure it out. That afternoon, I started digging through David's files. And let me tell you, it was like stepping into a haunted house. His code was chaotic. Variables were named things like temp1 and nuffinal version 2, with no documentation to explain what they actually did. I had to reverse engineer half the logic just to figure out where to start. By 6 o'clock, the cracks were starting to show. Every time I fixed one thing, 3 more bugs popped up. I grabbed a coffee, convinced myself I just needed a second wind, and kept going. The office started to empty out around 7 p.m. People were saying their goodbyes, wishing me luck as they grabbed their coats. By 9 p.m., it was just me, my laptop, and the hum of the air conditioning. At some point, my phone buzzed, and I jumped like I'd been caught stealing. It was Lisa. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice tight with stress. "Almost there," I lied. I wasn't even close. When I hung up, I sat there for a second, staring at the screen. I could feel the pressure building in my chest. I told myself, just a few more hours. You've got this. But by midnight, my brain started playing tricks on me. The code on my screen blurred into a sea of symbols. I found myself rereading the same line of logic over and over, trying to figure out if it was even correct. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. Around 2 a.m., I hit a wall. Not a metaphorical wall, an actual wall. I got up to stretch and turned too fast, smacking my shoulder into the break room doorframe. That's when it hit me. I was so fried I could barely walk straight. I wanted to quit. For the first time, I thought about packing up my stuff, walking out the door, and letting someone else deal with this disaster. But then that stupid voice in my head came back. If not you, then who? It was the same thing I told myself 100 times before, but this time it felt more like a trap than a motivator. So, I stayed. I made another cup of coffee, my 4th, 5th, I'd lost count, and I went back to the screen, even though my eyes felt like sandpaper. By the time the sun started peeking through the blinds, I realized something. I'd been working for over 20 hours straight. The project still wasn't done, but I was. I was completely, utterly drained. And yet, as I sat there staring at the mess I'd made, I felt something shift. I wasn't the same person who'd walked into the office the day before. The first few hours after sunrise were a blur. I wasn't even sure if I was awake or just functioning on autopilot. The office was empty except for me, and everything outside the windows felt distant, like I was watching a muted movie. The birds chirped, cars passed by, and somewhere out there, people were starting their day. Meanwhile, I was still glued to my screen, hunched over like a zombie. The first real jolt came when I reached for my coffee cup, only to realize it was empty. Not just empty, bone dry. I hadn't even noticed drinking the last drop. That's when it hit me. I was running on fumes. My hands were trembling, and my eyes burned like someone had sprinkled sand in them. The code I'd been writing started to look strange. I'd catch myself staring at a function for what felt like minutes, trying to figure out what was wrong, only to realize it was fine. At one point, I forgot the syntax for a basic loop. A loop. Something I could normally write in my sleep. And then there was the paranoia. Every ping from Slack felt like an alarm bell. Every email notification made my chest tighten. I was constantly thinking, what if I miss something? What if I screw this up? The weight of the project, David's mess, the looming deadline, Lisa's expectations, all of it felt like it was crushing me. At around 10 a.m., Lisa called. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. Hey, just checking in, she said. How's it coming along? I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Almost there, I lied again. Okay, she said after a pause. Let me know if you need anything. When the call ended, I just sat there for a moment, staring at my phone. I didn't need something, help, rest, maybe a time machine to undo agreeing to take this on. But instead of asking for any of that, I pushed the thought aside and kept going. By noon, I hit another wall. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since, when? Dinner the night before? My head pounded from all the caffeine, and my wrists ached from typing. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes for what I thought would be a quick break, and next thing I knew, my head jerked forward. I'd fallen asleep. The dream, or whatever it was bizarre. I was trapped in a maze of endless lines of code, with red error messages flashing at every turn. Every time I tried to fix one, another would pop up, blocking my way. David's voice echoed in the background, laughing and saying, "Good luck with that, buddy." I woke up with a start, heart pounding and mouth dry. The screen in front of me was still the same, the cursor blinking like it was mocking me. This wasn't working. I needed to get out of the office, even if just for a few minutes. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, squinting against the daylight. The fresh air hit me like a slap to the face. It was freezing, sharp and bracing, and for a moment, I felt alive again. The street was buzzing with activity. People walking to lunch, chatting on their phones, living their normal lives. I stood there, trying to ground myself, but all I could think about was the clock ticking down. 20 minutes, I told myself. You can spare 20 minutes. I walked down the block to a corner deli and ordered a sandwich and a bottle of water. The guy behind the counter moved so slowly, I wanted to scream. Didn't he understand I was on the verge of collapse? When he finally handed me the bag, I muttered a quick thanks and power walked back to the office. Sitting back at my desk, I devoured the sandwich in 3 bites and chugged half the water. For a brief moment, I felt, okay, like maybe I could actually pull this off. But as I opened up my laptop and stared at David's code again, the doubts came flooding back. I wasn't just tired, I was drained, emotionally and mentally. And for the first time, I wondered if this was worth it. Was finishing this project really worth sacrificing my sanity? By the time the afternoon rolled around, I was officially a mess. My eyes felt like they were glued open, my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every little sound, the hum of the HVAC, the ping of an email, set my teeth on edge. I was deep into David's payment integration code, trying to figure out why the transactions kept failing. At first, I thought it was a server-side issue, but then I realized the problem was deeper. Somewhere in the tangled mess of his work, there was a line of code sabotaging the entire process. I stared at it for what felt like hours, running test after test, but nothing made sense. And that's when I lost it. I slammed my fist on the desk so hard that my coffee cup tipped over, spilling cold coffee across a stack of papers. Great, I muttered, grabbing a handful of napkins to mop up the mess. My vision blurred, and I realized I wasn't just angry. I was on the verge of tears. For a moment, I sat there, breathing heavily, wondering how I'd gotten to this point. Was it really just the project? Or had I been running myself into the ground for years without even noticing? I grabbed my phone and opened Slack, ready to send a message to Lisa. I had the words typed out, "I can't do this. I need help." But I couldn't bring myself to hit send. It felt like admitting defeat, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I stood up and paced around the office. The movement helped, a little. It felt good to stretch my legs, even if the rest of me was screaming for sleep. I walked over to the window and stared out at the city below. From up here, everything looked so calm. Tiny cars crawling along the streets, people walking in and out of buildings, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. When I sat back down, I decided to try a different approach. If I couldn't fix the payment integration directly, maybe I could build a workaround. I opened a new file and started writing fresh code, hoping to bypass the issue entirely. It was risky and probably not the cleanest solution, but at this point, I was desperate. The hours ticked by. My stomach growled again, but I ignored it. My phone buzzed with texts from friends asking if I wanted to grab dinner, but I silenced it without even looking at the messages. Nothing else mattered except getting this done. By 7 p.m., I had something that almost worked. The transactions were going through, but the system was throwing up error messages on the back end. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And then, disaster struck. As I was running one last test, my laptop froze. The screen turned white, and a spinning wheel appeared in the middle. No, 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 I muttered, frantically clicking the trackpad. I tried restarting the program, but nothing happened. Finally, I forced a shutdown and rebooted the system. When the desktop came back on, I opened the project folder, and my heart sank. The file I'd been working on was gone. Just gone. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. All that work, all those hours, and it was just gone. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the screen, too stunned to move. Then something inside me snapped. I grabbed my jacket, shoved my laptop into my bag, and walked out of the office without looking back. Stepping outside felt like breaking the surface after holding my breath underwater for way too long. The air was crisp and sharp, biting against my skin as if to remind me I was still alive. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet moved on their own, one heavy step after another. The streets had a strange calm to them at night. Streetlights cast golden halos on the pavement, and the faint sounds of the city hummed in the background. Tires rolling over wet asphalt, distant laughter from a bar, the occasional honk of a car. A couple walked past me, holding hands and laughing softly. For a second, I felt like I was on the outside of life, watching the world move on without me. I kept walking until I saw a small park tucked between two buildings. It was the kind of place I'd normally pass by without a second thought, but tonight, it felt like exactly where I needed to be. I sank onto an empty bench, leaning back and staring up at the night sky. The stars weren't particularly bright. City lights drowned out most of them, but they were there, faint and steady. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself just sit and do nothing. No laptop, no phone, no notifications pulling at my attention. Just me and the quiet. At first, my mind wouldn't shut up. Thoughts bounced around like ping-pong balls. The code I still hadn't fixed, the files I'd lost, the email from Lisa I still hadn't answered. But eventually, even those thoughts started to fade, replaced by a heavy, all-encompassing exhaustion. And then came the questions. Why had I let it get this far? Why did I feel like I had to carry the weight of the entire project on my back? Somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that being reliable meant saying yes to everything, no matter the cost. But as I sat there on that cold bench, I realized I didn't even know what I was trying to prove, or who I was trying to prove it to. I pulled out my phone and stared at Lisa's name in my contacts. My thumb hovered over it for a long moment. I could text her, tell her I couldn't do this anymore, that I needed help. But instead, my eyes drifted to another name, Maggie. Maggie was someone I hadn't talked to in ages, an old friend who had a way of cutting through my **T without making me feel judged. Before I could overthink it, I tapped her name and hit call. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Hey, stranger," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "What's the occasion?" I let out a dry laugh. Not much. Just needed someone to talk to." Her tone shifted immediately. "Okay, what's going on?" And that was all it took. The words came tumbling out. The marathon work session, David's disappearance, the meltdown at the office. I told her about the spilled coffee, the lost file, the overwhelming pressure to fix everything on my own. She didn't interrupt once. When I finally finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "Wow. First of all, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this. But second, you know this isn't sustainable, right?" I sighed, leaning forward and running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, I know. Do you, though?" she pressed. "Because it sounds like you're still trying to convince yourself that if you just push a little harder, everything will magically fall into place." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. She wasn't wrong. "You've got to set boundaries," she continued. "People can't read your mind. If you're drowning, you need to tell someone. Otherwise, they'll just assume you're fine." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't saying anything I didn't already know deep down, but hearing it from someone else made it feel real. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter. The problems were still there, but they didn't feel quite as suffocating. Maggie didn't give me a magical solution, but she reminded me of something I'd forgotten. I didn't have to do this alone. When I got back to the office, it was nearly midnight. The building was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above. I sat down at my desk and stared at my laptop. Part of me wanted to keep pushing, to grind through the night until everything was perfect. But Maggie's voice echoed in my head. It's okay to let some things slide. I opened a fresh document and started over, focusing only on the essentials. No frills, no overthinking. Just what needed to be done. By 4 a.m., I had something workable. Not perfect, but good enough. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. The sun was just starting to rise when I finally leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. My makeshift solution wasn't elegant, but it worked. Transactions processed cleanly, error messages were gone, and the system was stable enough for the client to demo. I wanted to feel relief. Hell, I deserved to feel it. But all I felt was numb. The quiet of the office was almost unsettling. Papers were scattered across my desk, coffee cups piled up like sad trophies of my marathon session. My head was pounding, my shoulders stiff, but I wasn't thinking about the pain. I was thinking about what came next. I sent the updated files to Lisa with a quick note. Here's the build. It's functional, but might need more polish later. Let me know if there's any feedback. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I added another line. We need to talk about workload distribution. This isn't sustainable. Hitting send felt strangely empowering. For once, I wasn't pretending to have everything under control. About an hour later, Lisa called. I braced myself, expecting her to critique my work or, worse, tell me it wasn't good enough. Instead, her tone surprised me. This is solid, she said. Thank you for pulling this together. I know it wasn't easy. I could barely process her words. Was that gratitude? I also saw your note, she continued, her voice softening. You're right. We need to fix this. Let's meet later to figure out a better system. You've been carrying too much. Hearing that lifted a weight I didn't even realize I was still carrying. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. When the call ended, I leaned back and closed my eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax. But my relief didn't last long. My phone buzzed with a message from one of the junior developers on the team. Hey, can you review something for me? Not urgent, but I could use your input. I stared at the screen for a long moment, torn between my instinct to say yes and the voice in my head, Maggie's voice, reminding me it was okay to say no. Finally, I typed back. Can't right now. Let's touch base tomorrow. Hitting send felt like a small victory. With the project finally out of the way, I decided it was time to leave the office. The city was fully awake now, the streets bustling with people heading to work or grabbing coffee. I stopped at a diner on the way home, ordering the biggest breakfast they had, pancakes, eggs, bacon, the works. As I sat there, watching the world go by through the diner's window, I thought about everything that had happened over the past few days. The stress, the burnout, the realization that I couldn't keep living like this. It wasn't just about the job, it was about how I saw myself. For so long, I'd tied my self-worth to being the guy who could handle anything. The one who never said no, who always delivered. But sitting there, eating pancakes at a wobbly diner table, I realized something important. It's okay to not be everything to everyone. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed, fully clothed, and passed out within seconds. I woke up that evening to a string of messages from Lisa and a few teammates, all thanking me for my work and checking in to see how I was doing. It felt good, really good. But I also knew it was just the beginning. I'd made it through the storm, but now I had to figure out how to keep it from happening again. Setting boundaries, saying no, and letting go of the idea that my value was tied to how much I could endure. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. The next day, I walked into the office with a new sense of clarity. My desk was still a mess, and the to-do list hadn't gotten any shorter, but for the first time, I felt like I had control. It wasn't about proving myself anymore. It was about taking care of myself.